How many books are in the Bible? It sounds like a question with a single answer. It isn't. Ask a Protestant and they'll tell you 66. Ask a Catholic and the number climbs. Ask an Eastern Orthodox Christian and it climbs again. And then, high in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, in monasteries that have been copying scripture by hand for 1500 years, you'll find a Bible that answers differently. A Bible with 81 books. The largest, most varied collection of sacred writings in all of traditional Christianity. Inside it are texts most people in the West have never read, some they have never heard of. And one of them is a book about fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and the end of the world. So the question is not really how many books are in the Bible. The question is why the answer depends on where you're standing. Let's begin with the place itself. Not Rome, not Jerusalem. A highland kingdom on the Horn of Africa, on the eastern edge of the continent, where the land rises into thin air and old stone. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and its sister church in Eritrea carry this 81-book canon between them. The word Tewahedo means made one. And for these communities, the Bible was never a fixed, printed object handed down from a single authority. It was something older and stranger, a living library copied in a sacred language called Ge'ez, read aloud, chanted, carried through centuries by monks in remote cells. To understand why their Bible looks the way it does, you have to set aside almost everything you assume about how Scripture was decided. Here's what I find striking about that word, canon. We use it as if it means a list, a final sealed inventory of approved books. But a canon was never just a list. It was a map of memory. It showed what a community chose to carry into the future and what it quietly let fall away. Different communities, separated by language, geography, and time, carried different things. There was no single moment when the whole Christian world sat down and agreed. There was no master switch. What happened instead was slower and far more human. And once you see the canon that way, as memory rather than decree, the Ethiopian Bible stops looking like an oddity and starts looking like a survivor. Consider the numbers. The Protestant Bible holds 66 books. The Catholic Bible adds a set of writings known as the Deuterocanon, books like Tobit, Judith, and the Wisdom of Solomon. The Eastern Orthodox churches accept an even wider range, and the Ethiopian canon contains nearly all of these, and then keeps going. According to the scholar Robert Cowley, whose 1974 study of the Ethiopian canon remains a reference point, Western researchers eventually sorted these books into two groups. A narrower canon, full of texts the West would recognize, and a broader canon, which adds works of church order found almost nowhere else. But here is the detail that ought to give us pause. The number most often given is 81. The Ethiopian Church itself uses it, and yet no two lists of those 81 books are exactly alike. The ancient Ethiopian law code, the Fetha Nagast, declares plainly that the canon contains 81 books. Then it names only 73. The missing 8 were filled in later by scholars who knew the total had to be 81 and worked backward to reach it. Read that again slowly. The number was older and more certain than the list it was meant to count. There is, even now, no single definitive catalogue published by the Church's highest authority. The 81 is less a finished inventory than a way of saying complete, whole, lacking nothing. What goes into that completeness is where the story turns. Most of the New Testament is exactly what you'd expect, the same 27 books shared across nearly all of Christianity. The difference lives in the older writings. Unique to the Ethiopian Old Testament, or nearly so, are 4 works that the rest of the Christian world largely set aside. The Paralipomena of Jeremiah, the 3 books of Maccabean, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch. 3 things stand out to me about that list. First, these are not crude forgeries or fringe curiosities. They are ancient, some of them older than books the West does accept. The 3 books of Maccabean, for instance, are sometimes called the Ethiopian Maccabees. But here's what most people get wrong. They have nothing to do with the Maccabees in a Catholic Bible. Different heroes, a different story, a separate tradition that grew up entirely in Africa. The way I read this, it tells you something important. Ethiopia was not simply hoarding the West's cast-offs, it was writing and keeping scripture of its own. Second, these books were not lost in the way we usually mean, buried, destroyed, erased. They were simply read in one place and not another. And third, the most famous of them, the Book of Enoch, survives complete in only one language on earth. Geez. The language of the Ethiopian Church. Fragments exist elsewhere, scraps in Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls, pieces in Greek and Latin. But the whole book, intact, came down to us through Ethiopia alone. Now, it is tempting to reach for the dramatic explanation, to say the Church removed these books, that someone, somewhere, decided the truth was dangerous and struck it from the page. I understand the pull of that story, but the way I read the evidence, it is not what happened. There was no council that gathered to delete Enoch from the world. What happened was that the Latin West, over centuries, gradually stopped copying it, stopped reading it aloud, let it drift to the margins and then out of the frame entirely. Meanwhile, in the highlands of Africa, it stayed at the center of worship. Same book, 2 different fates, decided not by a conspiracy, but by 1,000 small choices about what was worth carrying forward. You might think this is ancient history, a quarrel about old manuscripts with no bearing on anything that matters now. But look at what it reveals about memory itself, how a civilization decides what to keep. We tend to assume the things that survived were meant to survive, that history is a filter that keeps the important and discards the rest. Ethiopia is the counterexample, sitting in plain sight. A whole library, preserved not because the world protected it, but because one community refused to forget. Notice what that does to the word lost. A book that was read, chanted, copied, and treasured for more than 1,000 years. Was it ever really lost? Or did the rest of us simply stop looking? And consider the strangeness of the geography. We are taught to picture the cradle of Christianity as a Mediterranean world. Rome, Constantinople, the cities of the Greek-speaking East. Africa, in that telling, is a place the faith arrived late, carried in by others. But the Ethiopian Canon quietly demolishes that picture. Here was a Christian kingdom, ancient and literate, copying scripture in its own sacred tongue, while much of Europe was still finding its feet. The books the West forgot were not preserved at the edge of the Christian world. They were preserved at one of its oldest centers. We just stopped thinking of it as a center. That is the deeper truth at work here, and it's worth sitting with. The Christianity that produced the Bible was never one thing flowing from one place. It was many communities, in many languages, holding many memories. The version that became dominant in the West, the one most of us inherited, is real and old and rich. But it is not the whole story. It is one branch of a much wider tree. And the Ethiopian Canon is the branch that kept growing in a direction the others did not follow. So we return to where we started, in those mountain monasteries, where a monk turns a page of cracked parchment by the light of a narrow window. On that page are words about angels who fell from heaven, about giants who walked the earth, about a final reckoning. Words the rest of the Christian world quietly left behind, and Ethiopia chose to keep. To understand how that choice was made and why it held, we have to begin with the strangest book of them all, the one the West nearly lost, the Book of Enoch. A mountain in the dark, cold wind off bare rock, 200 figures descending through the night air toward the summit, their feet touching stone that no one had walked before. According to the oldest layer of the Book of Enoch, this is where it began. On a peak the text calls Hermon, where a company of angels swore an oath to each other and broke the boundary between heaven and earth. They had seen the daughters of men. They had decided to come down, and nothing afterward would be the same. That is not a scene from the Bible most people own. It is from a book that the Ethiopian Church has read as scripture for more than 1,000 years, and that almost everyone else stopped reading entirely. So before we ask why Ethiopia kept it, we should understand what it actually says, because the contents are far stranger and far more influential than their absence from the Western Bible would suggest. Start with the man himself. In the book of Genesis, Enoch is barely a whisper, a name in a genealogy, the great-grandfather of Noah, a man who walked with God and then was gone. Taken, the text says, without dying. A few verses, no more. But in the Book of Enoch, that whisper becomes a roar. Enoch is no longer a footnote. He is a seer, a traveller through the heavens, a man shown the architecture of the cosmos and the mechanics of the final judgment. The book is not one work, but 5, stitched together over time. The oldest section, the part scholars call the Book of the Watchers, is the one that has haunted the imagination ever since. Here is the story it tells. A group of angels, the Watchers, look down on humankind and desire the women they see. Led by their chiefs, they descend, take wives, and father a race of giants, the beings Genesis calls the Nephilim. But the Watchers bring more than children. They bring knowledge, forbidden knowledge, the making of weapons, the working of metals, sorcery, and the cutting of roots, and the reading of the stars. The world, in Enoch's telling, is corrupted not only by violence, but by knowing, by secrets that were never meant to cross from heaven into human hands. And for this, judgment comes. The giants destroy each other, the Watchers are bound beneath the earth to await their punishment, and the flood, when it arrives, is not a random catastrophe, it is a cleansing, Now, here's what I find striking about this. Composed in stages somewhere between 300 and 100 years before the birth of Christ, the Book of Enoch was not a marginal text in its own time. Fragments of it, in its original Aramaic, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, proof that it circulated widely among Jews in the centuries before Christianity even existed. The Watchers, the Giants, the Forbidden Knowledge, these were not obscure curiosities. They were part of the mental furniture of the ancient world, and the early Christians knew it. Watch how deep this goes. The New Testament letter of Jude, a short, sharp text near the very end of the Christian Bible, quotes the Book of Enoch directly, names Enoch as the speaker, and treats his words as a true prophecy. As the scholar Bart Ehrman has observed, this gives Enoch a strange distinction. It is the one apocryphal book that the New Testament itself appears to cite as authoritative scripture. The Church Fathers of the first centuries, figures like Irenaeus, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria, knew the book and wrestled with it. For a while, Enoch sat near the center of the Christian imagination.
So why did the West let it go?
Notice what the deciding question really was. It was not, in the end, whether the stories were powerful. They obviously were. The question the early church kept asking was about authority. Who wrote this? And could a book attributed to a man from 7 generations after Adam really have been written by him? Most concluded that it could not. That this was what scholars call a pseudepigraphon, a work written long after the figure whose name it bears, in his voice, but not by his hand. That judgment, more than any conspiracy, is what pushed Enoch to the margins of Western Christianity. Not a ban, a verdict about who was allowed to speak for God. And here's what I find quietly revealing about that verdict. The same standard, applied honestly, would have unsettled half the books the West did keep. Authorship in the ancient world was a slipperier thing than we like to admit. Enoch failed a test that few of its neighbours could have passed cleanly either. Ethiopia reached a different verdict. There, Enoch was scripture. Read, chanted, copied, sacred. And the consequence of that single divergence is astonishing. The full Book of Enoch, the complete text, survives in only one language on earth: Ge'ez, the sacred tongue of the Ethiopian Church. Everywhere else it crumbled into fragments, those Aramaic scraps at Qumran, a few pieces in Greek and Latin. The whole of it, intact, came down to us through Ethiopia alone. When a curious world finally went looking, it had to send for it. In the year 1773, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce returned from 6 years in the Ethiopian highlands carrying 3 Ge'ez copies of Enoch. One of them ended up in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. That is how the West got its lost book back. Not by rediscovering its own copy, but by borrowing Ethiopia's. Enoch was not the only thing Ethiopia preserved. Consider its companion, the Book of Jubilees. If Enoch expanded the heavens, Jubilees reorganized time. It retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus, but threaded through a rigid framework of sacred chronology. Periods of 7 weeks of years, each week 7 years long, every event pinned to its exact place in the calendar. And the calendar itself is the point. Jubilees insists on a solar year of exactly 364 days, 52 weeks, no remainder, so that every holy day falls forever on the same day of the week, never drifting, never in doubt. Copies of Jubilees, like Enoch, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tells you it once mattered to communities far beyond Africa. The way I read this, Jubilees was about control of the most slippery thing there is, time itself. To fix the calendar was to fix the festivals, and to fix the festivals was to be certain you were worshipping on exactly the day God intended. Then there are the 3 books called Maccabean. And here's where most people get tripped up. The name sounds like Maccabees, the famous books of Jewish revolt found in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. They are not the same, not even close. The Ethiopian Maccabean tell entirely different stories, of a man named Maccabeus and his sons standing firm against an idol-worshipping king, of martyrdom and fidelity to God under pressure. Different heroes, different events. A separate tradition that grew up in Ge'ez and stayed there, untranslated until the 21st century. The way I read this, the Maccabean are the clearest proof of something easy to miss. Ethiopia was not merely a vault for the West's discarded books. It was a living source of scripture in its own right, writing and keeping texts that no one else ever held. Pull back, and a single question rises out of all of it. Who gets to decide what counts as sacred? Is a book holy because of who supposedly wrote it? Or because a community read it, sang it, lived by it, and refused to let it die? The West answered one way and let these books slip from its grasp. Ethiopia answered another and held them fast. Neither answer is obviously wrong, but only one of them kept the Book of Enoch whole. You might think this is ancient history, a dead argument about dead manuscripts. It isn't. We make the same kind of choice every day now, on a far larger scale, deciding what to save and what to let dissolve, which records survive the next migration of servers and which quietly vanish. What this tells us is uncomfortable. Survival has never been the same as truth or even importance. Things last because someone keeps choosing them. Enoch lasted because in one corner of the world, the choosing never stopped. And that is what should stay with us. The books the West called lost were never lost to the people who kept reading them. They were only lost to those who looked away. Somewhere in a highland monastery, by the light of a narrow window, a monk turns a page of cracked parchment and reads of angels descending in the dark. The same words his predecessors copied 15 centuries ago. The book never left. We did.
A ship went down in the Red Sea, and a library was saved.
That sounds like nonsense. The two events are separated by 1,000 miles and several centuries, but follow the thread and they connect. Sometime around the year 340, a vessel sailing the Red Sea coast met disaster. Most aboard were killed. 2 young men from Tyre, on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, survived and were taken captive, carried inland to the court of a kingdom that the rest of the world barely knew existed. One of those young men was named Frumentius. Had that ship completed its voyage, had those 2 boys sailed safely home, the entire story of the Ethiopian Bible might never have happened. Because Frumentius, the shipwrecked captive, would become the man who turned an African kingdom toward Christianity. And that turn is the reason the Book of Enoch still exists. So let's go to the kingdom itself. Its name was Aksum, and here's what I find most people get wrong about it. They imagine Ethiopia as remote, isolated, a backwater that received Christianity late and second-hand. The opposite is closer to the truth. Aksum sat astride the trade routes of the Red Sea, the hinge between Africa, Arabia, Egypt, the Roman world, and the Indian Ocean beyond. Merchants passed through carrying ivory, gold, incense, and ideas. This was not the edge of the ancient world. It was one of its crossroads.
And a crossroads is exactly the kind of place where a new faith can take root. The young king of Aksum was named Ezana.
Frumentius, the captive, became a fixture at his court, and in time something remarkable occurred. According to the church historian Rufinus, whose account is one of our earliest sources, Frumentius converted the king. Ezana embraced Christianity, and not quietly. He declared it the faith of his kingdom. He became, as far as we know, the first ruler anywhere to place the cross on his coins, stamping the new religion into the very currency that moved along those trade routes. The exact year is debated. Scholars place his conversion somewhere in the 4th century, most likely around its middle. What matters is the scale of the decision. A king did not merely change his own beliefs, he changed the spiritual direction of a civilization. Frumentius, meanwhile, travelled to Alexandria in Egypt, where the patriarch Athanasius ordained him as the first bishop of Aksum. Notice what that single act established. It tied the new Ethiopian church not to Rome, but to Alexandria, to the Christianity of Egypt and the East. When the Roman Emperor Constantius later wrote demanding that Ezana replace Frumentius with a bishop of his own preferred faction, the king refused. From its very beginning, Ethiopian Christianity answered to no European authority. It grew along its own line. And that independence, more than anything else, is why its Bible would eventually look so different. But a faith needs a text, and a text needs a language. This is where the real preservation begins. Over the centuries that followed, somewhere between the 4th and the 7th, the Bible was translated into Ge'ez, the sacred tongue of Aksum. The Old Testament came largely from the Greek Septuagint, the New Testament from the Greek as well. The work was done by many hands across many years, though tradition credits Frumentius with beginning it. And a crucial part of that labour fell to a group of foreign monks who arrived later, in the late 5th century, fleeing theological battles raging in the wider Christian world. History remembers them as the 9 saints. The way I read the 9 saints, they are the hinge of this whole story. They came, by tradition, from across the Byzantine world, Syria, Constantinople, Anatolia, even Rome, though they are often described simply as Syrian. They were escaping the aftermath of a great church council that had condemned their understanding of Christ's nature as heresy. In Ethiopia, far from that quarrel, they found refuge, and they went to work. They founded monasteries, they translated scripture and Christian texts into Ge'ez. They planted a form of monastic life so deep in Ethiopian soil that it has never left. Their disciple, a man named Yared, would shape the very music of the Ethiopian liturgy. What strikes me most is the leverage of it. A handful of exiles, unwelcome in their own homelands, built the machinery that would carry an entire library through the centuries. Because that is what a monastery is when you look closely. Not a museum, a machine for remembering. A monk copies a manuscript by hand. Another reads it aloud in worship. The calendar of feasts demands it be chanted year after year. A book that is used does not die. It is renewed with every copy, every recitation, every novice taught to read it. Ge'ez did not merely translate scripture. It became a vault, sealed by liturgy and ritual, in which texts the rest of the world discarded stayed alive. The complete Book of Enoch survived in Ge'ez and nowhere else, precisely because this machine never stopped turning.
Here's what I find easy to underestimate about that.
A manuscript is a fragile thing. Parchment cracks, ink fades, fire and damp and rot do their patient work. The only defense against time is repetition. Every generation that copies a book buys it another century. Stop copying, and the clock starts running. In the Latin West, the clock started running on Enoch sometime in the early centuries, and by the medieval period, the book had all but vanished from view. In Ethiopia, the copying never stopped. Same text, 2 clocks. One was wound faithfully for 1,500 years, the other was allowed to wind down. That difference, repeated quietly across countless monastery scriptoriums, is the whole secret of why the Ethiopian Bible is what it is. And here's where the evidence becomes something you can hold in your hands. In a monastery in the Tigray highlands, set among mountains at 7,000 feet, the monks of Abba Garima guard 2 ancient gospel books. For centuries, outside scholars assumed they were medieval, copied perhaps around the turn of the first millennium. Then, around the year 2010, researchers were permitted to take tiny samples of the parchment for radiocarbon dating at Oxford. The results stunned them. The Garima Gospels dated not to the medieval period, but to late antiquity, somewhere between the years 330 and 650. The older of the 2 volumes is now considered the earliest surviving complete illustrated Christian manuscript anywhere on earth. Written in Ge'ez, bound in a monastery the modern world had almost forgotten. Sit with what that means. The Garima Gospels survived, while nearly every other early Ethiopian manuscript was destroyed in the turbulent centuries between. They predate the famous illustrated Gospel of Syria that scholars once believed was the oldest. And they were sitting in an African monastery the whole time, venerated by monks who touched them to their foreheads, kissed their pages, and never imagined the rest of the world would one day need them to rewrite the history of the Christian book.
Pull back, and the pattern of preservation comes clear. Ethiopia did not keep these texts because it forgot to throw them out. That is the lazy assumption, and it is wrong. Preservation was not passive. It was 1,000 active choices repeated across 15 centuries. To copy, to chant, to teach, to translate, to defend a bishop against an emperor, to maintain a language long after the rest of the population had moved on to other tongues. Even today, most Ethiopians cannot read Ge'ez, yet the manuscripts are still treated as sacred, still carried through the congregation during the Mass. The keeping never required understanding every word. It required only the refusal to let go. You might think this is ancient history, the dusty backstory of a remote church. But what this tells us reaches further. The things that survive from the past are not the things that deserved to survive. They are the things someone chose to carry. Rome had power and lost its libraries to fire and neglect. Aksum had faith and a language, and it kept a library the empires let burn. The difference was never wealth or might. It was the decision, made and remade, that these particular words were worth the labor of another copy. So the books were saved by a shipwreck, by a king, by exiled monks, by a tongue built to hold them. But a question still waits at the end of this road. If Ethiopia could preserve so much, why did the rest of Christendom let it go?
To answer that, we have to leave the highlands and ask the oldest, hardest question of all. Not what is in the Bible, but who decided. In the year 1665, an emperor of Ethiopia gave an order, and a fire was lit. The fuel was paper. Specifically, the religious writings the Ethiopians called the Books of the Franks, the texts left behind by European missionaries who had spent the previous decades trying to bend the ancient church toward Rome. Emperor Fasilides wanted them gone, not hidden, burned. And in that bonfire lies the answer to the question this whole story has been building toward. Because to understand why Ethiopia's Bible still holds 81 books, you have to understand the moment it nearly didn't. The moment the wider Christian world reached into the highlands and very nearly took the older memory away. But start further back, because the deeper truth is this: no Bible was ever simply born. The Bible became a Bible slowly, through arguments and translations, through councils and empires, and the quiet labour of monks. The version most of us inherited feels eternal, fixed, handed down whole. It was not. It was assembled. And the assembling looked different in every corner of the Christian world. A canon, in other words, was a process, not a moment. In the first centuries after Christ, dozens of texts circulated among Christian communities. Some were read aloud in worship. Some were treasured in one city and unknown in the next. Some were deeply influential, yet never quite made the official list. There was no single grand vote, no day when the whole faith gathered to settle the matter once and for all. Different regions, working in different languages, arrived at different answers. And then those answers hardened into tradition until they felt less like choices and more like facts of nature. Here's what I find most revealing about that. The Western Bible and the Ethiopian Bible are not the same book with a few extra chapters. They are two different acts of remembering. The West built its scripture around the Hebrew foundation and the Greek New Testament, carried forward through the Latin Church, and then, in the upheaval of the Protestant Reformation, narrowed toward the 66-book canon that millions now treat as definitive. Ethiopia took another road entirely. It kept the older, wider world of Second Temple Jewish writing alive. It held on to Enoch, onto Jubilees, onto the 3 books of Maccabean, onto texts of church order that the West never canonized at all. The way I read this, the two Bibles are like two branches of one tree that stopped touching long ago and grew ever after in different directions. So what did the West lose when it let those branches go? Let me be careful here, because the easy answer is the wrong one. The West did not lose the truth, as if Ethiopia alone held the real Bible and everyone else a counterfeit. That framing is a trap, and it is false. What was lost was something subtler and, in its way, sadder. An older imagination of the biblical world. The vivid apocalyptic vision of fallen angels and cosmic judgment that shaped how the earliest Christians thought. The sense of sacred time that pulsed through Jubilees. The reminder, uncomfortable, persistent, that early Christianity was never a single thing flowing from a single center. What the West lost was not information, it was range.
It was the memory of how strange and various the faith had been at its beginning. And range, once lost, is hard to recover. You cannot miss what you no longer know existed. For most of Christian history, the West did not even know it had forgotten anything. It simply assumed its Bible was the Bible, that the 66 books on the shelf were the whole inheritance, rather than one careful selection from a far larger and wilder library. And then came the moment it might have lost even more. In the early 1600s, Roman Catholic missionaries arrived in Ethiopia, the most gifted among them a Spanish Jesuit named Pedro Paez. Paez was patient, intelligent, fluent in the local ways, and he did what no European had managed before. He converted the emperor himself. Susenyos embraced Catholicism, and in the early 1620s he declared it the religion of the state. Think about what that meant. The most powerful man in Ethiopia had aligned his ancient church with Rome. Rome, whose Canon had no place for Enoch, no place for Jubilees, no place for the broader Ethiopian scriptures. Notice what was suddenly at stake. The very texts that made the Ethiopian Bible singular, the angels and giants of Enoch, the sacred calendar of Jubilees, the African books of Maccabean, now stood on the wrong side of imperial favour. What followed was not surrender, it was civil war. The Ethiopian people, devoted to the faith of their ancestors, rose against the imposition. The country tore itself apart over which Christianity it would be. And in 1632, worn down by the bloodshed, Susenyos reversed himself. He proclaimed the restoration of the old faith and abdicated in favour of his son. That son was Fasilides, the man who decades later would order the books of the Franks burned. Fasilides expelled the Jesuits, sealed the country off from Europe, and turned Ethiopia inward for the better part of 2 centuries. The older memory had been pulled to the very edge of the cliff and then hauled back. This wasn't the first time an outside power tried to standardize a faith on its own terms, and it would not be the last. But here's what strikes me about the Ethiopian case. The thing that saved the 81-book Bible was not an argument. No one won a debate about Canon. No scholar produced a document that settled the question. What saved it was a people who would not let go of what they had carried, who chose civil war over the surrender of their scriptures. Preservation, even at the end, proved to be an act of will. The books survived because when the pressure came, an entire society decided they were worth fighting for. And there is something humbling in that. We tend to imagine that Scripture endures on the strength of its ideas alone, that a true text will somehow always find a way to last. The history of the Ethiopian canon says otherwise. Texts endure because people are willing to bleed for them. You might think this is ancient history, a forgotten quarrel in a faraway empire. But it presses on something very much alive. We still live with the consequences of who got to decide. Ask most people in the West to name the cradles of Christianity, and they will say Rome, Jerusalem, perhaps Constantinople. Almost no one says Aksum. Yet here was one of the oldest Christian civilizations on earth, literate, devout, copying scripture in its own sacred tongue, while much of Europe was still finding its feet. What this tells us is how narrow our inherited map of the past really is. We were taught that Christianity was a European story that later travelled outward.
The Ethiopian Bible quietly insists otherwise. The faith was African and Asian and Mediterranean all at once, from very near the beginning. We simply stopped drawing those parts of the map, and so we arrive where we always knew we would. Ethiopia did not hide the Bible. It did not smuggle away a secret, forbidden truth to wield against the faith of others. It did something quieter and more profound. It remembered differently. It kept reading the books the rest of the world set down, kept chanting them, kept copying them by hand in mountain monasteries through 15 centuries of war and isolation and change. In Ethiopia, Enoch still walked among the angels. Jubilees still measured out its sacred time. And ancient monks still bent over pages the West had forgotten how to read. The real question, in the end, is not whether Ethiopia added too much to its Bible. The deeper, harder question is whether the rest of the world remembered too little. Maybe these were never extra books at all. Maybe they were an older memory of what the Bible once could be, preserved not by accident, not by conspiracy, but by a people who simply refused to forget. The candle in those monasteries has burned low for a very long time. It has never gone out. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.